Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies, gentlemen, and dear students. I'm Jubin Godarzi, an associate professor and the acting director of the International Relations Program here at Webster University Geneva campus. On behalf of Webster University and the International Relations Department, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for attending this event, the first that we will organize in 2022. More will follow, including one next week on the legitimate and illegitimate use of police and force in democracies, which is going to be on Thursday, March 3rd at 6:30 p.m. in this room, but it will also be a hybrid event. So for those of you who are interested, also it's very topical, it's very relevant in terms of what's been happening recently, both in Canada with the Freedom Convoy, in France and other countries. So please do look it up on our website, webster.ch/events, and we will have more events also throughout the year. The topic of this afternoon's event, of course, has gained even more importance and relevance in view of events over the past 24 hours. So it was by sheer coincidence we scheduled the event for today, and we've had some major developments over the past 24 hours. I'm very pleased that we have a fine and distinguished panel of gentlemen scholars and experts to discuss, analyze, and shed light on the current crisis involving Russia, Ukraine, and the Western powers. Unfortunately, all the lady scholars, experts I reached out to invite, and there were 2 to 3 of them, including an ambassador, had other commitments and could not participate in this event. So I did my best in terms of trying to have some degree of gender parity, but hopefully on other occasions. Before we turn to our speakers, I would like to make some opening remarks to provide some food for thought and perhaps shake up the kaleidoscope a bit. The Cold War ended some 3 decades ago with a thaw in US-Soviet relations, the lifting of the Iron Curtain in Europe, and the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. However, sadly, it seems we have come full circle and entered a new era of East-West rivalry and animosity. This begs the question, how did this come about? The current crisis over the status of Ukraine is a major manifestation of what has gone wrong gradually over the past 30 or so years. Ukraine is a country which is of vital historical, cultural, political, and strategic importance to Russia, but also more recently to the West. So what went wrong? Who is to blame? The mainstream media and political pundits have very simplistic and reductionist explanations, looking at the situation as a binary in black and white terms. However, the situation is more complex and calls for a more nuanced and sophisticated approach to understand and analyze the current crisis and its origins and its root causes. Hence, the reason for this event bringing together scholars and specialists to shed light on the subject. You may recall what the prominent French scholar and sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville said almost 2 centuries ago, and I quote, "A simple but false idea will always have greater weight in the world than a true but complex idea," unquote. Interestingly, in his seminal work, Democracy in America, published in 1835, de Tocqueville also stated, and I quote, this is a long quote, but I think it's very interesting and kind of prophetic. "There are now 2 great nations in the world, which, starting from different points, seem to be advancing towards the same goal, the Russians and the Americans. Both have grown in obscurity, and while the world's attention was occupied elsewhere, they have suddenly taken their place among the leading nations, making the world take note of their birth and their greatness almost at the same instant. All other peoples seem to have reached their natural limits and to need nothing to preserve them. But these 2 are growing. Their points of departure are different and their paths diverse. Nevertheless, each seems called by some secret providence one day to hold in its hands the destinies of half the world," unquote. The Cold War between 1945 and 1990 added an ideological dimension to the rivalry between the capitalist democracies of the West, led by the United States, and the socialist authoritarian states of the East, controlled by the Soviet Union. However, it should be underscored that Russia has always presented a dilemma and a challenge to the West, a country that is neither fully Western nor completely Eastern, a Eurasian civilization and power, the largest country in the world, one viewed by the West with a mixture of awe and admiration, and at the same time, contempt and condescension. A poignant example, I believe, of the latter being during the First World War, subsequent to the Russian Revolution and the toppling of the Romanov dynasty, when King George V of England refused to grant his own cousin and wartime ally, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and his family, refuge in Britain, almost certainly condemning them and his relatives, his relative and his family to death at the hands of the Bolsheviks shortly afterwards. To conclude, keep in mind that NATO was established in 1949, and according to the first Secretary General, Lord Hastings Lionel Ismay, in order to, and I quote what he said about the purpose of NATO, keep the Soviets out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. This raises another interesting question. What exactly has been the purpose of NATO since the end of the Cold War over the past 3 decades? So on that note, I'm going to basically shift to our guest speakers. Our first guest speaker who is here present, we have 2 speakers here and 2 are joining us from Canterbury and also Moscow. Our first speaker, I will introduce each speaker before they speak, is Dr. Paul Vallée. Pleasure to have you, who is a French and American dual citizen and an associate fellow with the Geneva Center for Security Policy, GCSP, which he joined in 2015, where he conducts research and also executive education training. His research interests are European, Russian, and American foreign and defense policies, as well as diplomatic history and political institutions. Dr. Vallée was educated in France, the United States, and the United Kingdom in political science and international relations. He received his PhD from Cambridge University. Prior to coming to Geneva, Dr. Vallée taught modern history and international relations for 10 years at Sciences Po Paris, and also in other Paris-based institutions. So with no further ado, I hand over to Professor Vallée.
Thank you, Professor. It's really a great pleasure to be here. My first visit to Webster. I would like to thank also the staff for helping us to reach to our audience, not just in the room, but across, and our fellow panelists as well. As our moderator was explaining, my brief is to talk a little bit about the excuse the expression, Western take on these events. And by that, of course, I will mainly mean the various European and North American actors who are part of this. Now, it may seem, of course, that when we look at the confrontation undergoing between Ukraine and Russia, that we're looking at what might be, of course, a localized conflict. But the West, in its diverse components, has actually featured prominently in this issue since the beginning. So even though there's perhaps a tendency among some in US and in Europe who feel that involvement in this issue is perhaps a little bit over the top, the fact we're going to look at is that Western involvement is a given, whether we like it or not. And the question we'd like to address today is, what is this going to be like? So I'll try and develop this focusing around 3 points, which I think then will probably articulate well with what our other speakers and what the Q&A session will want to develop. So forgive me if I'm sometimes a little brief on this, because I want to leave more time for the discussion. The first question I'd like to mention is, well, how has the West been involved in this crisis so far? And where does it actually fit in the views and calculations of the local parties? And by that, I'll mean chiefly Ukraine and Russia. Our second point is to consider whether there's a division or unity among the Western powers in relation to this crisis. And the third point, which is perhaps going to be rather more unanswered questions, as the events are still unfolding, is about what are the options for the West to deal with this crisis. So as I was saying, to begin with my first point, the West is featured in this crisis since the origins. And one could say that the fate of Ukraine and Russia's action towards it, which we were hearing about in the introduction, have always been in some way part of the West's business. If you recall, of course, the immediate origins of the current crisis will go back to the winter of 2013-2014, when negotiations were underway at the end of 2013 between the European Union and the then Ukrainian government to sign an association agreement, the kind of agreements that the EU has signed with a number of all of the neighbors to its east, but also sometimes to its south on the other side of the Mediterranean, and indeed with Russia. Such an agreement was being negotiated between the EU and Ukraine, and ended up not being signed at the time because of a perception that began to develop in Moscow that the signature of this agreement would actually mark a EU encroachment upon what Moscow would consider as part of its sphere of influence. And perhaps another important impression at the time was that there was seemingly no great difference made between this policy of engagement towards the eastern neighbors by the EU and the types of engagement dialogues or agreements that NATO, on the other hand, was also passing with a number of the same countries in the same region as well. So this confusion, of course, has been, I think, an important aspect to understand at least Moscow's reaction to what it felt the West was doing in that area of the world. Now, it has to be said that, of course, at the time, both Ukraine, but its neighbor Belarus as well, had been engaging their respective governments. The Belarus one, of course, is still the same, essentially. It's the Ukrainian one that moved on. Both of them were engaged in some kind of balancing act between their Western neighbors and with Russia, trying to have it both ways, often in many cases. And of course, this is, of course, something that led to the decision of a government in Ukraine that was perceived as Russian-leaning under Viktor Yanukovych, began to negotiate with the EU, and all of a sudden, because there were pressures applied from Moscow, decided not to sign it. And that is something that put that government on a collision course with its own population and ignited the protests, which eventually led to the downfall of that government in February 2014, so almost to the day today. And that, of course, in turn, triggered the immediate reaction by Russia with the military intervention in the Crimea, and a few months later in the two Donbas oblasts of the far east of the country. Now, what characterized the Western reaction to this, both the US and the EU, was the fact that, well, most of them acted rather, or reacted, I should say, rather slowly and piecemeal to these actions. And in no small measure because there was a certain reticence in both the North American and European capitals to antagonize Russia that much. The then US administration under President Obama chose a policy which has already been practicing in a number of other areas, which they call lead from behind. And it's so very much delegated to the Europeans what they felt would be the frontline reaction to this Russian pressure on Ukraine. And you could even see that further because in the years following for the remainder of the Obama mandate, President Obama himself wasn't really the point man on policies to Ukraine. He delegated that to the then Vice President Joe Biden. And we'll see how that had a bit of an impact on US domestic policy in the end. What also characterized, of course, the European reaction was that there were a few countries that decided to act as point on this issue, and chiefly you'll find France and Germany that formed this so-called Normandy format, a contact group to try to negotiate ceasefire to the ongoing conflict in Donbass at the time. You also find another example of an individual country caught in the events, and that was the Netherlands, by the tragic fact that overwhelming number of its nationals were on board the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, which was downed in July 2014 by a surface-to-air missile that had been supplied to the Ukrainian separatists by the Russian regular army. And on that notice, it's very interesting to see that not on that case, when the Netherlands was trying to obtain judicial review over that particular incident, there wasn't always kind of a productive and united European front on that as well, too. The only instance in which you actually see the Europeans acting really unitedly was in the implementation of sanctions that were adopted after Russia proclaimed the annexation of Crimea. And very interestingly, even though there were recurrent over the years down to today, there were recurrent efforts that were led by either individual European states or states that happen to be led by politicians who happen to be more friendly to the regime of Vladimir Putin in Russia. These sanctions eventually never got lifted, even though a lot of people mounted attempts to try to repeal these sanctions as well. So, of course, this disunity is, I think, something that has characterized the reaction to the first phase of the crisis. And it's not entirely impossible that it was something that was fit into the calculations of how this phase of the crisis has developed. And I'd end up, at this point by paraphrasing François Mitterrand's expression in 1983 before the West German Bundestag. I might say that today the pro-Putin, pro-Russia lobbyists are in the West, but the Russian troops are in the annexed regions in the East. So moving on to the second point, which is, I think, quite crucial in that, and that's the notion of Western division. As we saw, the Western engagement, the European engagement via the Normandy format and the Minsk II agreements managed to achieve a ceasefire, but never solved decisively the issue. And in some ways, well, the Europeans might be forgiven for trying, but in trying to negotiate with Russia, they also suffered from a considerable lack of leverage. In part because, of course, Europe does have an energy and raw materials dependency on Russia. And also, of course, the hesitations across Europe about whether or not they can acquire a strategic autonomy is still not being solved for most of our adult lives. US engagement, as we saw, was fairly reduced in this matter, and it's a point to make as well that it further reduced itself during the Trump administration, in which Ukraine really only featured for domestic purposes when Donald Trump was trying to get the Ukrainian government to dig up bad news about Joe Biden to foil his candidacy to the elections in 2020. So you can perhaps understand that calculations in Moscow would be that Western division would be a probability when the tensions reignited at the start of 2021. And they might have even been confirmed in that sentiment because they observed also a rather intense transatlantic row that surfaced in the summer of 21 after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which drew very severe criticism, in particular from the European allies who had been part of the US effort there at the at the time. There's also the fact that you could perceive this moment or this window of opportunity, if I might call it, as one of particular political weakness affecting most of the Western powers. So obviously, on the US front, the Biden administration has its ongoing internal political difficulties. In Germany, the political retirement of Angela Merkel has removed, of course, an important political heavyweight and a person who had been probably the chief negotiator with Vladimir Putin in the European ranks, not only because of course, her fluent Russian speaking skills, but she was also being, of course, replaced by what was seen as perhaps a more political, vulnerable, and diverse so-called traffic-like coalition led by the current chancellor, who is still, of course, learning the ropes since he's been invested only barely a few weeks ago. And of course, if you look at the other great powers in Europe, well, of course, the UK itself has, since Brexit, has been charting its own particular course, but it's one that in general has been characterized by tense relations with Russia anyway. And in France, of course, too, you also have perhaps an internal weakness in the fact that there are the impending elections this coming spring. And Emmanuel Macron is actually, of course, being contested by a number of other candidates, including perhaps at least three who one might actually call Moscow's political clients. So, of course, the final point I'd make on that would be, of course, the formulation on December 17th by Russia directly to the United States of what it saw as its essential terms that seemed to put Ukraine a little bit in the sideshow of this, what appeared now to be the real objective of Russia, asking the United States to roll back the strategic situation in Europe to 1997, of course, to guarantee that Ukraine would never be allowed to join NATO. This was also probably calculated to actually start an eternal debate within the NATO membership between some countries that are more NATO skeptic and so on. And I'd say that that effort apparently was perhaps so over the top that it backfired. So my third and concluding point, so as not to run on too long, the fact is that what are the West's options to respond? Now, division, as we saw, could have been an outcome of this pressure, but it didn't. And why? I would opine that the past years for many Westerners, even the ones that are best disposed towards Russia or the Putin regime, have been somewhat of a learning curve. And I'd say there's a strong perception of that, especially in Germany, because even if Berlin's positions are characterized by wishing to favor negotiation and caution, it seems that there were one too many provocations that really were seen as unfair answers to Germany's efforts at goodwill. And I would say that Russia, in fact, really lost a major lever there. And you can also feel it in the increasing desperation in Moscow to put pressure so that the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline should be put into operation. There's a lot invested in getting that pipeline underway. And of course, today, we now know that that has become an even more remote possibility. So that's also an important leverage that's been lost. I'd say Russia also failed to perhaps grasp more firmly the opportunity that they were offered by the French initiatives. Macron, since the start of his term, tried to launch a rapprochement with Russia, which he didn't even always coordinate with the other European partners, and as a result suffered a lot of criticism for that. But as far as the Russians were concerned, that seemed to be not a good offer enough. On the other hand, you perhaps notice that against expectations, I'd say the US strategy to respond to the later aspects of this crisis have been, rather rather cunning in many ways. The US avoided to fall into several traps, especially when they promised that they would not fight for Ukraine. That is something that really disarmed a major part of the Russian narrative, seeking to show that Ukraine was being egged on by the West. They are not even pressing further for NATO, for Ukraine to join NATO. Of course, that also reinforced, I think, the common knowledge that it only takes one NATO member to object to Ukraine joining, and so that happening, which is said by the Russians to be extremely likely, is in fact quite unlikely in this matter. Now, also, of course, the US government showed since last June in the summit in Geneva a willingness to discuss face-to-face with the Russians. And that, I think, is also, of course, an important argument that was aimed at the European allies, that the US was definitely not on this action in a provocation mode. The fact that the US, contrary to shooting them down as it has in other occasions, tolerated different European, so chiefly French and German, but also British attempts at shuttle diplomacy, and managed to coordinate its actions with them, also shows a stronger unity than ever. Now, the likely response, as we know now, has been, of course, around economic sanctions, and we'll talk more about that at a later stage. But the point is that using the economic weapon is probably something that requires even more coordination amongst the Westerners. And I've noticed as well, too, that crucially, this is a point that will require even actions with countries that are neutral. And in particular, of course, the financial sanctions will also have an aspect that will influence this country, Switzerland, as well, too. So, of course, it's been said that, of course, the past sanctions regime hasn't deterred Russia or convinced Moscow to follow a possible negotiated path on this issue. There is an assumption, probably, but we'll talk more about that with my colleagues, that Russia has a fortress economy and that its association with China is going to help it withstand this aspect. But there's also, of course, the question of eventual military help from the West to support Ukraine's defense efforts, to at least make these operations costly for the Russian forces. The idea there, of course, would be to make the perception that's been emerging of the unpopularity of a conflict within the Russian population itself more obvious. So I'd conclude that, observing the facts so far, after a period in which the West definitely demonstrated some vulnerability in the early years of the crisis, both the Americans and the Europeans have kind of defied Putin's expectations. This might certainly affect the outcome in the newest phases. So it's very important to stress that the Ukrainian question is also finally being treated as a serious threat to Europe's peace, so by the West itself. That is a threat that should have been taken seriously, perhaps a long time ago. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valley. You covered a lot of ground, especially trying to very succinctly cover the three elements in terms of perceptions and interests and policies of the United States and also the Europeans. I'd be interested to hear more about a couple of things you said, also especially with regard to what you said was Russia's loss of the German lever, perhaps in the Q&A. Our next speaker, who I will going to introduce, it's a pleasure, who's joining us from Canterbury, England, is Professor Richard Sakwa. He's a professor of Russian and European politics at University of Kent in Canterbury, and is also a senior research fellow at the National Research University's Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and also an honorary professor in the Faculty of Political Science at Moscow State University. He has held lectureships at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom and also the University of California, Santa Cruz in the US. He did his graduate studies in history at the London School of Economics, where I also did graduate work. And also he obtained his PhD at the University of Birmingham. He has published extensively on Soviet, Russian, post-communist and international affairs. He's published many books, two of them which I am going to mention, which I think are relevant to today's talk, are Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands, which was published by Ivy Torres in London, 2016, and another book, which I read, which I thought was excellent, Russia Against the Rest, the Post-Cold War Crisis of World Order, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. So I hope Professor Sakwa can hear me. So with no further ado, I'll give the floor to you, Professor Sakwa. Thank you for joining us again.
Well, thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to join you, though sadly not physically, but I'm with you mentally. So I've got a few minutes, and clearly, as you say, this session was timed impeccably for a moment, a historical moment when European history and that world history is being shaped. I think that last night, the recognition of the two republics in the Donbass is the crossing of a Rubicon, which will shape the politics, international politics of a generation. And we simply don't know how the situation will develop. What I want to do is to give a little bit of context to the situation. And so the first one, and picking up on the previous speaker's larger picture, is how did we get into this mess in the first place, or this confrontation? And it's easy to blame one side or the other. But what I want to do initially is to argue that ultimately we have endured a 30 years crisis since the end of the first Cold War. And of course, we're now in the thick of the second Cold War. And this crisis, obviously, I'm not going to go into in any detail, but what I want to say, and this is, of course, was what Putin and others referred to when they put forwards their ideas on a European security treaty on the 17th of December last year, when they said, look, we need to get back to basic principles. And they refer to the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, the Paris Charter on a New Europe of November 1990, all the way through to the Istanbul Declaration of 1999, and indeed the Astana Declaration of 2010. So what were they saying? And it was about the question of the divisibility or indivisibility of European security. Can the security of one be achieved at the expense of the other, or was there a way in which to reconcile all interests, just as Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich, thought we could at the end of the Cold War and at the time in 1990, when there were the discussions about German unification and those promises given in February and later, March, all the way through, on the fact that NATO enlargement would be limited to the former Eastern Germany and not an inch further. So, as I say, I'm not going to go into all the detail, but there was at the very beginning a worm in the post-Cold War peace order. Now, Europeans, Western Europeans and the United States says everything was fine. Moscow has been saying for 30 years. Gorbachev said it, and Yeltsin said it, and Putin says it. Well, guys, it's not fine. You're expanding the Cold War security structure endlessly up to our borders. And, we're expected to accept it and to lump it. And Yeltsin already in December 1994 complained about this. So what was, how can we put this into some sort of systemic context? My argument is that at the end of the Cold War, two models of the post-Cold War peace order were on offer. Two models. They were compatible. They were quite compatible. That's why their hidden contradictions were hidden for so long. Now, what were these two peace orders? The first one was what I call the Charter Peace Order. based on the Charter International System established after or in and after 1945, focused on the United Nations, and its model of international politics is sovereign internationalism. Gorbachev says, look, the man who did more than anyone to bring an end to the Cold War, said, look, we can all live together, work together, just as the Soviet Union worked with the United States and other allies, and rightly so, to defeat Saddam Hussein in the first Iraq War when they'd invaded and occupied Kuwait. So this was a model of, great powers and other powers working together within the framework of the United Nations system, and of course, all of its subsequent protocols, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Its model was sovereign internationalism. The Soviet Union has given up its ideology of communism, revolutionary communism, however exhausted it may have been at the end. We are going to work together, and Moscow will remain a major capital, and so on. And we'll work with the United States and other powers to achieve public goods. Well, that in a nutshell is the first model, and the model, by the way, which Russia sticks to this day. And they mention it over and over again. This was the model that was outlined in that absolutely epochal joint declaration of China and Russia on the 4th of February, the opening day of the Beijing Winter Olympics this year. And they mentioned it over and over again. And so this is, as I said, we needed to pin it down. It's the Charter International System, sovereign internationalism, that it's not what many liberals argue back to old Westphalian dog-eat-dog spheres of interests. Ursula von der Leyen fundamentally misunderstood things in her address to the European Parliament earlier this week when she says the age of spheres of influence is over. Of course, in some ways they are, but the age of spheres of security are certainly far from over. And you have security has to be balanced between sovereign international states. So that's one model, the Gorbachev model, the Yeltsin model, the Putin model, and Putin's successor model. So don't wait to expect and say the demonization of Putin is meaningless now because it's a Russian position and it will stay the same. And it's a Beijing position and it will stay the same for a long time. The other model, so this model is not a bad one. The other model is, let's call it, a hegemonic piece, the hegemonic piece. It says, look, we, that is the West, we won the Cold War. And in some ways, of course, the West did win the Cold War. Its ideals of freedom, of market democracy, of liberty in all sorts of ways, did triumph ultimately. It was a victory, but it was a victory that within it had the seeds of hubris, the seeds of its own destruction, which we're now seeing today. And this hegemonic piece assumed, look, the United States is as powerful, just a little bit less than it was in 1945, when all the other powers, including the United Kingdom, had destroyed themselves in this terrible war. And we, and that is the United States, should provide leadership. And, we could welcome that as well. And US leadership is important to this day, and no one is denying that. But a hegemonic piece ultimately transforms that vision of liberal internationalism, which also contributed to the United Nations Charter International System. But this hegemonic piece transformed the good things about liberal internationalism into a more ambitious project, which many, many critics call liberal hegemony. It's Patrick Porter in the United Kingdom, John Mearsheimer in the United States, Stephen Walt in Harvard, and many, many more say, look, you overreached yourself. And of course, later on, you got this endless talk of a unipolar moment and so on. So, as I say, both ideas were good. Both ideas then were taken to excess and to extreme. And so this hegemonic piece, and China and Moscow would never be able to accept it. And so that is where we all got. So that's the context. And very briefly, I'll just say a few more points. I know I don't have long, but just to say that how do we get to where we are today? Obviously, NATO enlargement was the big issue, which I won't go into. I want to focus a couple of minutes on the Minsk Accords. They were mentioned earlier. The second one, Minsk 2, February 2015. And it was a fundamental attempt to negotiate a way in which these rebellious provinces, it's not quite clear what it should have been called, now it's a rather different game since last night, but negotiate how to return them to Ukrainian sovereignty. Now, it would have entailed massive compromise on both sides. Obviously, I understand why Kiev was reluctant to do so. But on the other hand, we're talking about nearly 4 million Ukrainian citizens who, in the last 7 years, have endured 80% of the infringements of the ceasefire. This is UN figures. 80% of the mortars, the shells, the sniper attacks, the killing have been assaulted and imposed on the citizens of the Donbass. And this, for some reason, has not entailed the sort of horror that we saw when the Serbs were doing the same to Sarajevo between 1992 and 95. So we had also added to it, because I know many people from the Donbass and, the way they suffered over these years. So, but the Minsk Accords, clearly, when you talk to Ukrainian politicians, they had no intention of implementing it. Zelensky was elected in April 2019 with over 70% of the vote as the peace candidate, just like Poroshenko was, by the way, in May 2014. Both of them became hostage to the mobilized militant nationalists. Again, we in the European Union, I'm sorry, I get used to being we no longer the European Union and the United Kingdom believed in, we find militant nationalism repugnant, and yet we give that sort of face of militant nationalism a free pass in Ukraine, exacerbated by the very explicit strategy by the hegemonic internationalism which dominated in the West. From the mid-1990s, I've just been rereading Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, in which, we all know, very explicitly he says, we have to keep Ukraine and Russia apart. Well, they did so with spectacular success. They poisoned the relationship between Kiev and Moscow. I'm sure the two could have poisoned it themselves without anybody's help, but certainly the help came. And the attempt was to avoid the possibility of Russia ever returning. So Minsk is fundamentally important. And, when Kiev politicians had no intention, and even if they did try to, like Zelensky initially after the Normandy format meeting in December 2019, was not going to be able to get it because of the mobilized militant nationalist contingent there. So, and also, with all of this, what was so astonishing for me was every 6 months, the European Union, through its much vaunted bloc cohesion, voted for sanctions on Russia for its failure to implement the Minsk Accords, when it was Kiev which had to do the next move to implement it. An absurd situation in which the West prided itself in the European Union on its bloc discipline. It was a bloc discipline which was reminiscent precisely of that brain death which Macron talked about for NATO, that we needed diverse views, we needed pluralism, we needed a discussion of how we got into this mess within the European Union. We needed more Macron. Well, I'm sorry for those who are not French to feel you probably had enough Macron, but nevertheless, we probably needed more so that we could have some mobilization. Instead of which, Angela Merkel used Minsk to keep her knee on Putin's neck for 7 years. And finally, it was quite clear that even once she's gone, it wasn't going to come about. Bloc discipline is not a good in and of itself. It's only if it's genuinely going to achieve peace with dignity for all sides. And that is where I come back to my first point, the fact that the peace order has to be indivisible. All the documents, and this is Lavrov says it, Putin says it endlessly, that all the documents have two fundamental principles. And I went back and checked all of this. They always say free choice, which is important, of course, but it has to be indivisible. Security cannot be achieved at the expense of the other. Now, Moscow may be wrong in some of its exaggerated fears about NATO. In certain circumstances, as Marie-Elise Sarraute argues in her new book and her articles, that NATO enlargement in and of itself could have been not a bad idea, because it stops countries like Greece and Turkey going to war, it disciplines the smaller states, but it had to be within the framework of a larger overarching European peace order. Brzezinski makes this point, by the way, and many others, so that NATO enlargement is geopolitically perhaps sensible, but it has to be within a larger framework. And Brzezinski, even before Kennan, says if we don't do it, then Moscow will react badly to this. And of course, this is where it is now. A very brief word on Russian goals. You know, we've heard much about attempt to reestablish an empire to take over Ukraine. That's absolute nonsense. Russia's got absolutely no idea and no intention and no need to take over Ukraine. But is it not a legitimate question to have a friendly, neutral, safe, prosperous, democratic, sovereign Ukraine next door? Of course, that's what Russia's attempt through Minsk was all about. So it was, but bloc discipline simply wasn't going to accept the framework. Don't forget that neutrality was the Ukrainian position until December 2014, until just after the coup when it was taken away. So the question of Donbass was quite clearly, so Putin's expectations, everybody seems to know what his expectations are. They're very modest. And we all know that in Moscow, he came under huge pressure as a moderate. He was holding things back. His emotional speech last night was quite clearly a sign that he simply could no longer withstand it, because nothing was achieved. The negotiation, just to talk to Moscow, is not a concession. It's not appeasement. It's called diplomacy. And in our age, we see the death of diplomacy, instead of which we have a bloc discipline imposed on these great powers, Germany, France and others, Italy, which is worse than anything in the Cold War, where we don't allow that diversity, that debate about, hang on, why is the United States blocking Nord Stream 2? This is our European energy issue. My gas bill is 10 times bigger, or the price of gas now in the UK is 10 times what it was just 6 months ago. Why is the United States deciding whether Nord Stream 2 should be built or not? Where is our continental vision? Where is our European vision? Because I do believe that we are all Europeans, Russians, Ukrainians, British, French, etc. And we Europeans have failed to provide a genuine political framework for our pan-continentalism after the end of the Cold War, instead of which we have ceded the initiative to a hegemonic body whose center is not even in Europe. I believe that we should always remain friends with the United States. We should work with the United States. We should act as sometimes, as Churchill would say, sometimes guiding our friends over the water, because Churchill would say, the United States provides the muscle and we will provide the brain. Well, I don't know whether you would agree with that, but nevertheless, that's one way. So the outcome today, though, of course, is fundamentally negative. Our policies which we are pursuing, and the worst reaction to what happened last night is, let's do more of it. Let's have more sanctions. Let's have more punishment. Let's talk less to Moscow. Let's hector and bully and shout at it even more. Let's demonize Putin. Let's talk about the Putin's oligarchs. Let's talk about Putin's cronies more. All of this talk is a sign of a mass psychosis and decline of statesmanship in the West. It is like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but much more dangerous, because we don't have leaders like Bob Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, or Jack Kennedy, and all those other intelligent officials whom we now know, who could withstand the McNamaras and others who are saying bomb them, nuke them, beat them. Today, we only have the latter voices. We don't have genuine statesmen like de Gaulle, or even the German leaders of a previous generation, instead of which we have intelligence driven. The security services are driving policies, the media laps it up, and it becomes an echo chamber. And I think we as academics should withstand that and provide independent, critical analysis, however much it may cost us in both nerves and possibly reputations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sakwa, for your very illuminating and also provocative presentation. You gave us all a lot of food for thought. I concurred with several of the key points you said, and also towards the end, I would say we live in an age of mediocrity. We don't have those politicians, those diplomats, those statesmen who saw the Great Depressions, who saw World War I and II, and had a vision and had a wisdom to build a better world. We do not have that anymore, neither, even in the West, unfortunately. Our next speaker, it's my pleasure, who's here, is Dr. Vladimir. He is a member of the research faculty here at Webster University, Geneva, and also a lecturer in the Global Studies Institute at the University of Geneva. He's a specialist on Eastern Europe and also the former Soviet Union. He has worked as a consultant with various Swiss government agencies, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the United Nations Environmental Program, the World Bank, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, among others. He's written on politics and conflicts in post-Soviet space, including Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. He is author of the book War and Peace in the Caucasus, Russia's Troubled Frontier. He has a PhD from the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in History and International Politics. So it's my pleasure to give the floor, with no further ado, to Vladimir. Thank you. Switch. Yeah, should be good.
Okay, thank you, Javin, dear colleagues. Okay, the crisis in Ukraine is built on two original sins. One, Professor Sakwa just illustrated. It was the choice taken by the US, not by the West, not by Europe, not by Germany, not by France, by the US under Bill Clinton in '93 to push the Cold War breaking point to the east. So NATO expansion to the east meant keeping tension on the European continent, and at a certain point, this was going to create problems. And now when we look at the military balance on the European continent, we understand why the Russian president is pushing back. So that's one level. I'm not going to elaborate that one. There's another level, which is the Russian-Ukrainian relations. And I will talk about that. And on the level of Russian-Ukrainian relations, what is happening is a disaster. What is happening is a human tragedy. Ukraine is one of the most victimized countries on earth since the beginning of the 20th century. Go and have a look at what happened in this land during the First World War, during the Russian Civil War, what happened on this land during the Second World War, and what happened to Ukraine since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine lost 20% of its population since 1991. Just imagine the suffering that took place in this country. Still, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there was no Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Moscow and Kiev managed their difficult relations through negotiations, through diplomacy, through political means, and without war, without violence. Until 2014. And there I come to the second original sin, which this time was committed by Russia. Okay, Ukraine in 2014 was in internal trouble, right? There was the second revolution taking place. It was not the first one. The first revolution in Ukraine took place, the Orange Revolution took place in 2004. 10 years later, Ukraine was again in a period of instability. And in 2014, Russia decided to intervene. Russia decided to take over Crimea. Russia decided to support separatist movements in Donbass, in the eastern part of Ukraine. And by doing that, Russia left no choices to Kiev. Whoever is ruling in Kiev cannot cannot but be against Russia. By taking over Crimea and by encouraging war in Donetsk and Lugansk, Russia created endless tension with Kiev. And I understand that political leaders in Kiev could not go to compromises with Russia because Russia, by its actions in 2014, pushed Kiev to the West. Until then, look at the history between 1991 and 2014. Whoever came to power in Kiev had to make a balancing act between Moscow and the West. Not just because Ukraine is a big country, okay, on the European scale, but still Ukraine was sandwiched between two big poles. One was Russia and the other one is European Union and NATO to the West. But also Ukraine, its internal structure with Russian-speaking communities in the east and in the south, in Donbas and Crimea, being largely pro-Russian, but also Western Ukraine being anti-Russian for historical reasons. Whoever was ruling in Kiev had to kind of balance between these two forces internally, but also these two poles externally. But the acts of 2014 left no choice for the rulers in Kiev other than to be anti-Russian, to look for the West as a solution, and to seek support militarily, diplomatically, politically, and financially from the West. Now, in 2014, two things happened. One was Russia took over Crimea. So officially, from the Russian perspective, Crimea is part of the Russian Federation now. But then Russia did something different in Donbas. By supporting separatist forces in the eastern provinces, Russia created never-ending instability in these provinces. And now what happened yesterday was Russian President Vladimir Putin recognized these two former provinces of Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk, as sovereign states, and Russia sent its military forces as peacekeepers, I quote the term peacekeepers, into these provinces. Now the problem is that we do not know what are the boundaries of these two so-called sovereign states. So Russia, by recognizing these two provinces, is creating preconditions for continuous war with Ukraine. Because Russia is not recognizing the line of contact as the boundaries of these two provinces. Russia is claiming different segments of the former provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk, currently under the control of the Ukrainian military, to be part of the sovereign states, and therefore creating new challenges, security challenges, political challenges, and eventually conditions for a new war with Ukraine. Now, a new war with Ukraine is going to be a disaster for Ukraine, first of all, but also for Russia. Of course, Russia has a very impressive army, around 1 million soldiers currently mobilized. Of course, Russia has very important military budgets, over 60 billion yearly budget for its military. But at the same time, let's not imagine that further escalation of the situation militarily in Donbas will be similar to what happened in Crimea in 2014. Ukraine has no navy practically, but Ukraine does have an army, does have land forces. And since 2014, Ukraine did serious effort to restructure its military. Ukraine currently has something like 200,000 soldiers mobilized. So any war in Ukraine is going to be a disaster for Ukraine, first of all, for Russia, but also for the European continent. Because any further escalation will harden international relations, will make military means the predominant instruments of international relations, will throw soft power out of the window as it is being done today. And we already talked about diplomacy being completely marginalized and not utilized to regulate international tensions, crises, and conflicts. So we are in front of a disaster since 2014, and we are in front of a new escalation in Ukraine, but also in the eastern part of the European continent since yesterday. Let's not imagine that Russia will have the means to conquer Ukraine in spite of the impressive Russian military forces. American military adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan are full of lessons. Russian military adventures in the Northern Caucasus, Chechnya War I, Chechnya War II, which caused thousands of casualties, including thousands of Russian military losses, and tens of thousands of civilian losses in the North Caucasus, are full of lessons. So let's not imagine that the military can bring us solutions. We know that it's very easy to provoke a war, and it's very difficult to end one. I will conclude by making a remark on Russian President Putin's speech yesterday. He had a very long, nearly 1 hour speech in which maybe a quarter was about history. History is very important. History is very important to structure our societies. History seems to be very important to politicians, and very often politicians use history to justify war and peace. But I would invite colleagues, historians, to claim back history, because if we, as historians, analyze what Mr. Putin was saying yesterday, there we see that we have large number of issues with which we can be not in agreement. History should be claimed back by historians and not to be left to amateurs, to politicians, to others, to ideologues who use history as an instrument of nationalism, as an instrument for justification for war. And we need to study history, including the very rich history of this part of Eastern Europe that is very rich, as I said, and full of lessons, which would conclude that war is always the beginning of a tragedy, and we should do everything to avoid a new tragedy in Eastern Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Viken. You provided a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure you all agree. And one of the purposes of having this event was to show the diverse points of view and perspective. And as I said in my opening remarks, that things should not be looked as a binary. And I think, as I said, contrary to what we see in the mainstream press, and I think that's being shown by I think there's blame on both sides. I think the Western narrative is incomplete, it's flawed. At the same time, there are elements of the Russian narrative which also are flawed. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And of course, what you also said about Eastern Europe, and as I also said in my introductory remarks, there's a tendency, of course, often to simplify things, and what's been applied to Russia and Eastern Europe often over the past 10, 20 or more years can be applied to the region, which is my area of specialization and yours also, which is the Middle East, where again, you have a very, very simplistic narratives about the Middle East, the Muslim world, Iran, the Arabs, etc., the Arab-Israeli conflict, etc. So we need to basically keep an open mind, looking at the different perspectives and adopt a much more nuanced, sophisticated perspective. So thank you very much, Viken. I'm going to introduce now our fourth and final speaker, who joins us from the Russian Federation, from Moscow, Professor Dmitry Suslov, who is a Deputy Director at the Center for Contemporary European and International Studies at the National Research University's Higher School of Economics, and also is a Senior Lecturer at the International Affairs Department of the same institution, as well as being the Deputy Director for Research at the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. Professor Suslov is also a member of the Working Group on the Future of US-Russia Relations, which is a joint venture between the National Research University's Higher School of Economics and Harvard University in the United States. His research focuses on US foreign policy, Russian foreign policy, Russia-EU relations, and also US-Russian relations. He has degrees from St. Petersburg State University and St. Petersburg State Technical University. So with no further ado, it is my great pleasure to hand over the floor to Professor Suslov.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here and to participate in this distinguished panel and to see some very good old friends. Well, let me start by saying that the yesterday decision to recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk republics was a big surprise for me. And I cannot say that it was a pleasant surprise. I think that this decision was contrary to the Russian policy over the last 7 years. The policy which was focused on promoting transformation of Ukraine according to the Minsk agreements, which obliged Ukraine to conduct serious constitutional reform, decentralize, and actually involve the pro-Russian Donbas region into the Ukrainian state. And I was nearly sure that Russia would continue to do what Vladimir Putin called a creating tension and keeping tension, namely applying pressure to ensure eventually the implementation of the Minsk agreements. And I was wrong on that. The decision taken yesterday means that Kremlin came to conclusion that such a transformation of Ukraine through political reform, according to the Minsk agreements, was impossible. And that the West would not apply the necessary pressure to compel Ukraine to implement these Minsk agreements. So what next? The military conflict in Donbass itself might now freeze. It's unlikely that Ukraine would continue manageable escalation, let alone a full-fledged offensive with the Russian troops officially on the ground in Donbass. But as for the Ukraine conflict in a broader sense, and as for the Russia-West relations in a broader sense, I think that this is just the beginning. And I fully agree with Dr. Sakwa that the yesterday decision was historic. It would be absolutely wrong to assume that Russia now is satisfied with this tiny piece of damaged and ruined land, devastated land. And I want to make 3 preliminary assumptions, largely based on the very dramatic speech that Vladimir Putin gave yesterday, and which was briefly mentioned here. First, now there is a much greater clarity in Russia-West relations. Vladimir Putin said very clearly yesterday that the reason why the West refuses to compel Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreements is because the West wants to use Ukraine as an instrument and space for containment of Russia. Not just a geopolitical containment of Russia, but also military containment of Russia. So the Russia-West confrontation, which is 8 years old already, has moved definitely to a higher level. It became more unambiguous. The period of the Russia-West confrontation, which was in place over the last 8 years, is over now, and we are definitely at a different stage. Secondly, assumption, recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk, of course, kills the Minsk agreements, which, as I said, obliged Ukraine to reform and to decentralize. And this raises the following question. Whether Russia drops this purpose of Ukrainian transformation as such and accepts the fact that Ukraine will continue to develop as a sort of anti-Russia, consolidated in its identity, domestic politics, and foreign policy at the anti-Russian basis. Or, different option, Russia remains committed to the transformation of Ukraine, to the overcoming of post-2014 stage of Ukrainian development, and Russia just concludes that it is impossible to achieve this transformation through the Minsk agreements, through diplomacy. Well, the speech which Putin delivered yesterday makes an impression that the latter, not the former, is the case, so it's not the end. And the third assumption is that Russia is still deeply, deeply dissatisfied in the security sense. Putin said again very clearly that the current state of Ukrainian-West relations poses a military threat to Russia, not just geopolitical, but military threat to Russia. Whereas hypothetical accession of Ukraine into NATO would present existential threat to Russia. And make no mistake, Russia will deal with this problem. Recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk does not solve this problem at all. This problem could be solved in two alternative ways. Either a military action, which means a full-fledged war, or the second option is agreement on the security guarantees, which Russia has passed to the West, a deal between Russia and the United States and NATO, which would establish the new rules of the game, the rules which would remove the NATO question from the agenda, limit the scope of military cooperation between Ukraine and the West, and so on and so forth. And I really hope that despite the recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk, Russia and the West will continue negotiations over the security guarantees. Otherwise, you know, the alternative would be much more dramatic than the recognition of those two breakaway regions. Now, some words about the roots of the crisis. You know, we have to distinguish between the roots of Ukraine crisis per se and the roots of the general crisis of Russia-West relations, although these two problems are very closely linked. The general crisis of the Russia-West relations goes back to late 1980s, early 1990s. I fully agree with the analysis which was provided by Dr. Sakwa. And basically, you know, there is nothing new in the demands which Russia made. Canceling NATO enlargement, prohibiting deployments of strike weapons in the Russian neighborhood, and removing those deployments which have already been made. Look, Russia has been stating its fundamental dissatisfaction with how the European security order started to evolve, namely with the NATO-centric security order in Europe since early 1990s. Russia was in full dissatisfaction and disagreement with the principle, with an understanding according to which Russia has no real decision-making right on the core issues of the European security order. Russia obviously have been viewing NATO enlargement as a geopolitical threat, as exclusion of Russia from the European security order and emergence of such an order in Europe, which can threaten Russia. And also, obviously, Russia sees the prospect of Ukrainian accession into NATO as existential threat. So the threat which requires military, I mean, any instrument, including military, in order to prevent. The roots of Ukraine crisis per se go back to the dual enlargements, I mean, NATO and the European Union enlargements of 2004. From the Russian perspective, because these dual enlargements in 2004 kind of hijacked Ukraine from the Russia-centric orbit. It is necessary to remind to the audience, and please take note if you didn't know that back in 2003, just 1 year before the dual enlargements of NATO and the European Union, Ukraine was one of the 4 countries who laid the foundations for what today is the Eurasian Economic Union. And the memorandum was signed in Yalta, which was a part of Ukraine at that time. But the Orange Revolution of 2004 in Ukraine, which was explicitly supported and encouraged by the West, turned Ukrainian foreign policy orientation almost completely, full 180%. NATO decision taken in 2008 at the Bucharest summit to promise membership to Ukraine and Georgia in the indefinite future was, from the Russian perspective, an attempt to consolidate and cement the geopolitical results of the colored revolutions, including the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and to prevent their return to a Russia-centric orientation anytime soon. Then the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych normalized the situation. It reestablished balance in Ukrainian foreign policy, but the Euromaidan revolution in 2014, again, strongly supported by the West, again destroyed that balance. So from the Russian perspective, the West, which supported the Euromaidan revolution and fully institutionalized the results of the Euromaidan revolution, hijacked Ukraine for the second time. And the second time was worse than the first time because NATO membership promise was valid in 2014, unlike in 2004. And the pro-Russian forces in Ukraine were severely shattered in 2014. So Russia reacted as it did with the takeover of Crimea and with an attempt to compel Ukraine to reverse the Euromaidan revolution, first through war, and then through the Minsk agreements, which no longer exist now. For Russia to feel itself secure and satisfied in Europe, three conditions must be met. First, Russia must be a full-fledged decision maker, which certainly implies a tacit right of the veto over crucial decisions like we have in the UN Security Council. Second, a buffer zone, military buffer zone between Russia and NATO must exist. And three, Ukraine must be at least a neutral country in between, which conducts a balanced foreign and internal policy. Ukraine must not become an anti-Russia in its domestic identity and anti-Russian fortress in its foreign policy. And this is Ukraine becoming a country in between is precisely what Russia wants now. Not a participant of the Russia-centric arrangement. This is impossible, and we learned the lesson from the Euromaidan revolution in 2014, but a country in between. Again, there is nothing new here. So why did Russia decide to intensify all these developments, to create all this pressure now? Because of the change of the context. The context changed both locally and globally, and this predetermined both the timing, the urgency of the Russian actions, and also the impression that now Russia can achieve actually what it has been unsuccessfully aspiring for the last 30 years. First, change of the local context. Russia completely lost hope in Zelensky, or President Zelensky, or I would say even broadly in Ukraine in general, implementing the Minsk agreements and changing itself into a more balanced and less anti-Russian way. You know, Zelensky was campaigning for presidency as a candidate for peace. He was a Russian speaker. And so on and so forth. But after becoming president, he started to conduct a much more hardline, much more anti-Russian policy. And unlike even the previous Ukrainian president Poroshenko, he not just sabotaged the implementation of the Minsk agreements, but he started to demand their revision, their rewriting, or their cancellation. And he was doing that with the Western support. So Russia obviously came to conclusion that it doesn't matter who is the president of Ukraine. You know, Ukraine will simply not implement the Minsk agreements. Ukraine will not transform by itself. External force must be applied to bring Ukrainian transformation. Of course, Russia would prefer the West to apply pressure on Ukraine, you know, to bring this Ukrainian transformation into a more balanced way, at least to implement the Minsk agreements. But Russia came to conclusion that the West will not do that. Second element of the change of the context, global. Biden administration has clearly identified China, not Russia, as the major adversary. And Biden administration made it clear that it wants to concentrate all the attention, all the resources on containing China. Thus, the United States was objectively interested in avoiding further escalation in Europe. It was interested in avoiding new sanctions against Russia, avoiding the military buildup in Central and Eastern Europe, because all this is done at the expense of American strategy and policy of containing China. And you know, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan showed that the Biden administration can take politically unpleasant but strategically necessary decisions, right? And Russia expected that the Biden administration could and still expects that Biden administration might take this strategically necessary decision with Russia in the near or middle term prospect. And by the way, the time frame for Russia is not so long. In 2024, when there is the new presidential elections in the United States, it would be much more difficult for Russia to make such a deal with the United States. It's much easier to do it with the Biden administration. Thus, a sort of now or never impression emerged in Moscow, right? And a very clear understanding that this window of opportunity for a deal with the United States will shut in 2024. So thus Russia decided to act. And the tension which Russia has created so far since the late 2021, of course, brought some significant results, by the way. They were not useless. The United States and NATO proclaimed readiness to discuss and even agree with Russia on some issues that they were not even willing to hear about just several months ago, such as INF missiles in Europe, NATO-Russian deconfliction mechanism, missile defense in Europe, and so on and so forth. Secondly, France and Germany really tried to pressure Ukraine on the Minsk agreements, but again, as the yesterday decision shows, they failed. And these achievements are not enough for Russia. And Russia will continue to take steps in order to make sure that Ukraine cannot be used as a platform for containment of Russia, and that Ukraine will eventually become a country in between. So as I said, this could be done either militarily by Russia itself, which will make the situation much worse in comparison with today. And by the way, I do not exclude this option completely. It would be very costly, of course, but not impossible. But the better way is to make an agreement on the security guarantees, including the cancellation of the NATO enlargement option. And Russia does not view this as something completely impossible and unimplementable. From the Russian perspective, this Russian demand does not violate the principle of the Paris Charter of New Europe, according to which countries have freedom to choose alliances, because from the Russian perspective, a freedom, this is a freedom to want. This is a freedom to have foreign policy aspirations, not an obligations for the countries to get what they want. And secondly, the Russian demands are not contrary to the NATO open door policy, because again, NATO open door policy does not oblige NATO to include any country that wants to join NATO. All the decisions are made by the alliance itself on the basis of the interests of the alliance and the security considerations of the alliance. What the Russian demands do violate is a principle according to which Russia must have no veto, no real decision-making right on the European security system. But this principle was relevant to the times which is no longer existent. This principle was relevant to the times when Russia was physically unable to inflict serious damage to the United States and NATO. Thus, there was an understanding at that time that NATO enlargement does not undermine the security of NATO countries. Well, today, Russia makes it very clear that enlargement does undermine security of not just the countries that would join NATO, but the security of NATO itself. And since we have confrontation, right, and let's recognize that, right, let's just accept the obvious truth. There is a new Cold War going on. There is the new confrontation. And in this new confrontational environment, Russia and NATO must act according to the principle of the confrontation, right? Which is that adversaries must respect the red lines of each other, even if they do not consider them legitimate, simply for the sake of avoiding war. This is what existed in the previous Cold War, and Russia wants this principle to become valid again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Suslov. For articulating. You covered a lot of ground in terms of also in view of what transpired last night with President Putin's speech, and of course its implications, the history in terms of what Russian interests and perceptions are, policy towards the Ukraine, NATO, and what Russia's endgame is. It's already a bit past 7, but we've had, I'm sure you all agree, we've had four very rich presentations, which also I'm sure many people have questions. Just before giving things over to going to Q&A in terms of the audience, the attendees, I think one thing which may be on the minds of many people who have listened to the 4 presentations, and I'm going to just throw this out and see if anybody wants to answer it. I think Professor Sakwa had to leave because of TV interview, but is the recognition of the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk reversible, in the sense that could it be a card that Moscow is going to play to then try to reach an agreement with the West, NATO and the US with regard to the status of Ukraine? So I'm gonna use my privilege as the moderator. So I'd like to see if anybody can answer that, and then we'll have questions and answers.
I can try.
Okay.
Well, the experience of Georgia, right? Because we have a very similar situation with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, shows that hypothetically the answer is yes, but practically it is no. Of course, officially Russia would never say that it can reverse the recognition. But again, the foreign policy community in Moscow, which might be wrong, and the Russian foreign policy community was wrong on the decision to recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk independence, thinks that it must be done under very strong conditions, that NATO membership for those countries must be excluded once and for all, right? That they must reject their aspirations to join NATO. They must proclaim neutrality, put it into the constitution, and so on and so forth, and conduct such decentralization, conduct such a political transition that it would become just impossible for them to apply and to aspire NATO membership. The scenario could be, if people know the so-called Cossack memorandum for Transnistria and Moldova, such a federalization of a country in which those pieces, the pro-Russian pieces, would actually have a veto over the foreign policy decisions. Under these terms, hypothetically yet. But since these terms are almost unimplementable, and again, the case with Georgia proves that, then in practical, I do not see the prospects, the real prospects for Russia to reverse this decision, at least in the next, I don't know, couple of years.
Thank you very much, Professor Suslov. I'm going to open it up now to people either in the audience or also online. If you could kindly introduce yourself and indicate to whom you're directing the question. So we'll alternate between one person here and if there's somebody online. So Arnaud, yes.
So hi, my name is Arnold. I'm a media student, also an international relations student, and I'm a last year. I'm a senior, and so I have a question for the entire panel. I don't know who's the best to answer that question, but during that talk, we haven't heard much about China, and so I was wondering, considering the rise of China as a potential economic adversary of the United States, how much influence do you think they have on each side of this conflict, and how much they can gain from it?
Thank you, Arnaud. I think Professor Suslov mentioned that in passing in the context of U.S.-Chinese relations. I don't know whether Professor Dr. Vallée, Dr. Chitarian, or Suslov would like to. I think.
Thank you for the question. Well, certainly, obviously, China's stance in this year probably has a very direct impact, and I think we have heard, especially I think from Professor Safo, about the importance of the February 4th agreement. I remember my reaction on hearing that was an interesting one as well too, because obviously some parts of the accord seem to be geared to be precisely one way in which Russia was hoping to withstand the loss of the European energy market with the closure of Nord Stream 2. That is that, well, if they can't supply gas to Western Europe, they're going to supply it to China, and there's an eager market there. And the Chinese have actually had the very subtle suggestion that the transaction should be actually settled in euros and not in dollars, anticipating, what might be the results of Russia being cut off from SWIFT, which is one of the very strict financial sanctions that have been put about by the US administration and by the Europeans as well too. Now, of course, if that goes ahead, and if Europeans do implement their own sets of sanctions, this question about transactions in euros will become as tricky to handle as transactions in dollars. So obviously, of course, China is actually, of course, being involved as a side actor to this crisis too. But obviously, it's going to be watching very closely at this issue too, because we do know, and that too was said by some of my colleagues on the panel, China has its own territorial claims and issues, and of course, certain particular interpretation about who can be sovereign and who cannot be so, and has to be condemned to belonging to some sphere of influence because the neighbor is just bigger. So in a way, you can see why the Chinese and the Russian perspectives align on this matter. It's obviously, of course, not one that certainly not much in Europe would subscribe to, but yeah, those are parts of the fact.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vallée. Anybody online who would like to ask a question from our speakers? If so, if you could please introduce yourself and, and indicate to whom you're directing the question. Anybody online in Zoom land?
In the meantime, can I just, as the people prepare their questions, also provide some follow-up comments on the China question?
Sure, if possible, briefly, Professor Suslov. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's not just the rise of China, but the US-China confrontation, which is the decisive factor behind the Russian action. And I said that it created quite a favorable context for Russia. You know, the US-China confrontation is a reason why China is not criticizing Russia. You know, Russia has just violated a principle which is sacred for Chinese foreign policy, territorial integrity, you know, because of Taiwan. And before, China was very critical of similar Russian actions. Now it is not. Right. And the reason, I mean, it is not praising Russia, but it is not criticizing Russia as well. The reason is just because China faces confrontation with the United States. And second point, very quickly, from the Russian perspective, the United States cannot prevail in simultaneous increase of the confrontation with Russia and with China at the same time.
Thank you very much. Anybody online? I'm going to turn then to the audience here, Orlando White. So, and then.
So my question is to the panel, and nobody mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis and what was happening there. That's the first parallels there. And the second thing, people are talking about invasion. And I'm from the Bahamas, 1983. The Americans invaded Grenada. So just some observation about invasion and parallels right now.
Thank you, Orlando White. Of course, he's not with us. I believe Professor Sakwa mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis in passing when he was talking about John F. Kennedy keeping his cool, being very statesmanlike to resolve the crisis with the Soviets. But does anybody here want to, whether Professor Vallée, Professor Chitarian, or Suslov, Professor Chitarian? Yeah.
Yes, in such a short time, we cannot mention everything. So for sure, there are lots of historical events, very important ones we didn't mention. Or if we mentioned, we didn't elaborate them enough. So Cuban Missile Crisis is one of them. So you're presuming that we are back to the Cold War, as Professor Suslov also insisted, which is very bad news, right, for all of us. About invasions, yes, I think we have not only the invasion of Grenada in 1983, but since then, so many others. We have Afghanistan, of course, as I mentioned, but more than Afghanistan, I think Iraq was a very important moment when Iraq, US war against Serbia in 1999, that was another very important moment. And the last one was the US, but also French and British military operations in Libya, which were very important for Russia to shift its strategic thinking. Yes, all these are interrelated, but let's pay attention. Are we talking superpower to superpower? You do this, I do that? Or states like Ukraine, Georgia, and others are also part of the international relations? Are we talking about the charter of the UN? Are we talking about international peace? Or are we talking about going back to imperialism, to colonialism, to wars? Because I'm stronger than you, which logic do we want to follow? And for the moment, I think we are in the wrong direction.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Chitarian. Anybody online before? Anybody online? It's one of the reasons I hate teaching hybrid. I always feel that people who are like online or don't get their fair chance, you know. That's why I like it either or, preferably everybody in. So,
Juben, good evening. Could you hear me? Nives Rumeniak is speaking.
yes, Professor.
Good evening.
Yes, please.
Yes, I would like, first of all, to congratulate on the panel discussions. They were all excellent. And as a historian, I would also like to emphasize one relatively recent historical event on the Balkans. Would somebody care to compare what was going on in the former Yugoslavia in 1990s and that type of crisis with the current Eastern European crisis, and the relationship, to compare the relationship between Russia and Ukraine with the relationship of Serbia and Croatia, because they were two main actors in the war, according to my opinion. Thank you very much.
Would anybody like to make a comment with regard to Dr. Valle? Yes.
Yes, certainly. I think as we've heard, and my colleagues were just alluding to it. Yes, the conflicts in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s do serve as part of the backdrop to this current crisis. We can draw some interesting parallels. If you recall, of course, the attempts to stop the fighting in former Yugoslavia at one time were mediated by the formation of a so-called contact group that included, of course, the UN, the P5, minus China at the time, but the Germany and the European Union and the UN as an organization got involved in that. And of course, when the Normandy format was created, at least it brought me back the memory of this, because I felt that there was an attempt that by bringing sort of a smaller format of negotiation, you could have, say, two honest brokers, so to speak, plus the two actual parties in this format. I think there are some limitations to that as well too, and Viken, I think, was just saying, I think very eloquently, the problem with such a format is that it does tend to talk over the heads of some other very important interested partners. And we were in a very a slightly different situation in the run up to the Dayton agreements and those of Minsk as well too. For Dayton, to some extent, after many years of the Serbs actually having the upper military hand, all of a sudden a reversal of fortune hit them, and that's where they were willing to compromise, which was, I think, very, very important. That kind of compromise didn't materialize then in 98, 99, when there was the same crisis over Kosovo. They decided to go to the strong hand, and then the Western powers indeed intervened, and that mediated format was broken. And here, of course, in the context of the Ukraine-Russian confrontation, back in 2015 for Minsk, Russia clearly had the upper military hand at the time, and so all the pressure was on Ukraine to indeed concede the ceasefire, and a lot of the political concessions, all the demands about the federalization and so on, were made on Ukraine. Now, it hasn't been much discussed, but Russia has a centralization problem of its own, and perhaps some of that medicine could be applied not just to Ukraine, but to the form of government inside Russia. It could also, of course, be a lot more tolerated to some of the other countries in the former Soviet Union. So I think there are indeed important parallels and historical memories that are driving the current crises that go back to these post-Yugoslav conflicts. They're still very much with us. We're very worried about the situation in Bosnia right now, which has taken a bit of a sideshow compared to all of the rest. But we also, of course, see from those times not just lessons, but limitations. So lessons have to be in both ways.
Thank you. Thank you also for that question by Professor Romaniak. She's the head of our international relations program, Webster Leiden in the Netherlands. So a close colleague.
Thank you, Juben.
Thank you, Ives. Mr. Abdulaziz Khan, back there, and then we'll see if there's anybody. I'd like to wrap up in the next 10 minutes. So please keep in mind also afterwards, those of you who are here, in terms of the speakers who are here, there's going to be drinks, thanks to the kind efforts of our events coordinator and the people who are helping. So there's be time to mingle and all that. Unfortunately, Professor Sacco had to leave, and Professor Suslov is, of course, in Russia. So, of course, we'll drink one to your health and say na zdarovya. So afterwards, so hopefully you can join us on another occasion. I'm sure there'll be other occasions, but hopefully under better circumstances and less alarming and less disappointing news. So Abdul Aziz, yes, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes.
And
yeah, got I have a lot of questions.
one.
Yeah.
One. Just one and two, yeah.
First of all, my name is Abdul Aziz Khan, international relations student. Thank you very much, revered panelists. Thank you very much for providing us with such food for thought and shedding light on so many things for us young people. Of course, we learn from you. Well, in times of conflict, there comes an institution to mind, the United Nations, and which was briefly mentioned, sadly. The United Nations has been chronically unable to stop unilateral action by rogue states. For example, Russia annexed Crimea, which emboldened Putin to lay claim to more territories and initiate the current crisis. How should that flaw be rectified? Does such unilateral actions prove the United Nations to be a paper tiger?
Thank you. Does anybody want to say anything about the United Nations? Professor Suslov, yes.
Thank you. I think that United Nations is very much able to stop and punish the behavior of rogue states, but it is designed in a way that it is absolutely unable to stop and punish permanent members of the UN Security Council. This is by default. You know, the founding fathers of the United Nations drew the lesson from the League of Nations and provided deliberately privileges to the winners in the Second World War, to the great powers of 1945, to make sure that they do not consider the United Nations as contrary to their interests, as a hypothetical threat, and that they work through the United Nations. Thus, the right of veto. And you know, there is an endless talk about the reform of the UN Security Council. But what is remarkable, the only agreement which the permanent members have arrived to is that their right of veto must not be touched. You know, anything else can be explored, but their particular privileges are sacred and must not be touched. You know, everyone is selfish, of course, right? And in international relations. So the United Nations cannot fix this problem. If I may, just 1 minute on the previous question on the comparison with the Balkans. From the Russian perspective, there is a fundamental difference. You know, the conflict between Serbia and Croatia accompanied the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. Of course, there were conflicts in the former post-Soviet space, which also accompanied the collapse of the Soviet Union, but not the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, right? So from the Russian perspective, I do not want you to agree with this, but I'm just explaining the Russian perspective. From the Russian perspective, the reason behind the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not local, as it was the case with the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia. It is the West which brought this conflict, you know, which kind of hijacked artificially Ukraine from its normal state of development, and that's it, right? And we are dealing with the consequences. A conflict in the Balkans, which is, although very important, is the Kosovo conflict, you know, because from the Russian perspective, it was that conflict which destroys the sacredity of the territorial integrity principle. And, you know, after Kosovo, to talk about territorial integrity of Ukraine is something weird from the Russian perspective, or at least double standards.
Thank you. We are, you know, we're supposed to stop at 7, so I'm just going to give one more person online and then one question here, and then we'll have to basically, I'd love to go on until midnight, whatever, but I'm sure that people are getting hungry. So anybody online who would like to ask a question? Yes, Mr. Piotr, yes. If you could introduce yourself and direct your question.
Thank you. Piotr Perczynski from Leiden campus. Thank you very much for a really fascinating panel. Very interesting. A quick question for Professor Suslov, if I may. You started by saying that you were unpleasantly surprised by the events, by the recent events. I would like you to tell us what is, in your view, the best scenario for Russia and what is the worst scenario for Russia now. Thank you.
Very quickly, the best scenario for Russia would be an agreement with the United States based on the Russian security guarantees proposals, not of course in the legally binding way, which is completely impossible, but some explicit agreement that Ukraine will never become a part of NATO, and that the United States and NATO diminish the scale of their military cooperation with Ukraine. This is considered as creating of a context, external context, which will compel Ukraine to develop in a more balanced way and to reform still despite the destruction of the Minsk agreements. The worst case scenario would be a full-fledged Russian invasion in Ukraine.
I thought that was very succinctly put. Thank you. Last question, Antonina Tachenko, and if you could direct it to yes.
Good evening, my name is Angelina. I'm a freshman Webster University student in Geneva. My major is IR. First of all, thank you for spreading awareness on the conflict. And according to the latest news, Germany froze the Nord Stream 2 pipeline as a response to Russia recognizing two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. Do you think that Germany adopted extended immediate deterrence as a third party as a response to a militarized crisis, which is a short-term technique, or is such a response final and permanent decision of Germany to prevent further dependence on Russia?
Would anybody like to take it? Maybe somebody first, either Professor Valle or we can, or Suslov.
Of course, one problem with Nord Stream is that it's actually being built, so it may not operate, but it's going to be there, and there'll always be this question about whether what to do with it. The question of energy needs, energy dependency is like the pipeline as a physical infrastructure, not going to go away either. But certainly I think that decision was taken today as the first and probably expected kind of reaction that at least Germany could take on its side. One also forgets that the European Commission was also involved in the actual licensing of whether this pipeline would go into operation, because obviously, of course, the gas that comes through it is not going to be sold, is not expected to be sold just to Germany, but throughout the Western European market, and help Professor Sokol get his gas bill down a little bit too. Perhaps that's the idea. But yes, I think Germany's responding over Nord Stream because it's I think is the one issue on which it has a particular say and a particular leverage. Is that a solution? Obviously not any more than military action or recognition or so on. We may have very differing takes on how this crisis has unfolded and who's really to blame. But at least one thing that I get from the rest of my colleagues on the panel is that we'd be looking towards some kind of negotiated solution. So arguments have to be put back and forth on this.
Thank you, Dr. Valle. I see Professor Sokol is with us. I hope get a very fruitful TV interview.
Yeah, I'm now back. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, good. I was just telling Professor Suslov earlier, we're about to end now, but of course we're going to have some drinks, and of course, unfortunately, you and Professor Suslov are not here. So we're going to drink one to you and say "Na zdоровье," cheers, as they say there. You also mentioned in passing Professor Mary-Elise Sarraute, who wrote the book "Not 1 Inch." Actually, she was one of the ladies I initially approached, but she's very busy from Johns Hopkins. And of course, she'd also, besides that book, written a couple of interesting journal articles. One, of course, which appeared in International Security a while back on the Clinton administration's decisions to expand NATO. Actually, here in the room, I've made copies of another article by Professor Joshua Ishkowitz Schifferson, who basically did some interesting work, archival work and all that, on the negotiations about the unification of Germany during the Bush senior administration and the Soviets, and about not expanding NATO. So for those of you who are here, there are copies of that article, very interesting. I wanted to, we're half an hour over time and dinner beckons, drinks and food and dinner beckon. I wanted to thank very much all our panelists, Dr. Valet here, Dr. Chatarian, your colleague, Professor Richard Satwa, who was also with us in June. We had a more modest program with Professor Jussi Hanimakki from the Graduate Institute right after the Putin-Biden summit here. And of course, I'd like to thank Professor Dmitry Suslov, who was highly recommended, and he did not disappoint at all, by my dear colleague, Professor Lionel Faton, who is also going to be chairing the event next week on the legitimate and illegitimate use of force by police in democracies. So please tune into that next week, Thursday, March 3rd at 6:30. I would like to thank you all very much. Have a good evening, and God.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yeah.
And cheers to you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jubin. Well done. Much appreciated. And to all the speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, that was good. Thank you. Very interesting discussion.
Thanks a lot. Please, you must be thirsty. Thanks. Provided great insight.